Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Thrive Live on LinkedIn Live and on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jason Walker, would you like to introduce our guest?
Yes, we have a great guest today, Jonathan McBride. And when we asked Jonathan to come on, he was super great about it. He wanted to come on. He was super personable, super friendly. Sometimes when you reach out to somebody who has the kind of credentials that Jonathan has and has worked for a president of the United States, you think they're going to be difficult, or, you're worried about working with them. And Jonathan was like one of the nicest people that I've ever talked to. Super open, friendly, accommodating, checked in. It's just not often that you work with somebody or get a chance to meet somebody that's just as nice as Jonathan is. So I'm super excited that he's on the show. Let me give you a little bit of a brief intro and we'll get into it. We're welcoming Jonathan McBride. He's the former global head of inclusion and diversity at BlackRock. He was the director of the Presidential Personnel Office in the White House. He was appointed in 2003 as special assistant to Obama and the deputy director of the Presidential Personnel Office from 2009. So Jonathan is just a wealth of knowledge and information on diversity, inclusion, and belonging. He's one of the top voices in the field right now, and we're really excited that Jonathan has agreed to come on and talk to us about this really important topic right now. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. That was quite an introduction. I'm not sure how I'm going to meet those expectations, but thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. He'll meet them very easily. So Jonathan, so tell us a little bit about what you're experiencing and seeing, in this field right now. Talk a little bit about some of the important things that are going on.
Well, maybe I should mention that I left BlackRock in December of 2019.
Okay.
And was going to take 2020 off as a year. And was actually traveling around the globe when COVID hit, and came back here to Southern California. I was doing a little bit of advising and working on some class ideas to potentially teach. And then George Floyd was murdered. And in the following couple of weeks, my phone and incoming phone calls were just incessant. And I basically started a consultancy then with a couple of friends, with the criteria being that we would spend time with people who were friends in need in that moment, CEOs, CXOs, board members, and people who are serious, who are trying to respond to this moment in a serious way. And so since then, the small group of us, between 4 and 5 people, have been working with companies that are kind of category leaders across many different industries. So it's provided a really interesting perspective, because as opposed to being in a single company, wrestling with all of the dynamics of the past little over a year, we've been working with a series of companies and nonprofits and academic institutions. So we've been seeing a very horizontal view of how people have been looking at it. And I would say that the human moment that was the COVID crisis, that got wrapped in another human moment that became the racial equity crisis, that then got wrapped into kind of what I would say is both an economic and a mental health set of crises, and you can keep going, has made this a really, really interesting year. And I would say that it set the stage for probably more honest, candid conversations over the past 12 months with leaders in different sectors, more progress, but also not as much progress as you'd think now that we're 14 months in, and we can talk about what that looks like. But I'm slightly encouraged by the progress that people have been made. I do think that there are some trends that have started that will continue. But it's just a reminder of how hard it is to get people to change behaviors, even when all of this is going on.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the progress, because when you and I spoke about 2 weeks ago, that's one of the things that we had a discussion about, is that there's been progress made, and then in certain situations, progress has slowed down. And then there are other companies that are out there that maybe are really slow to move the needle for a variety of reasons. So can you talk a little bit about those companies that are doing well, the things that you've seen that are positive, and then how do we keep moving forward for those companies that are basically not doing as much as they need to be doing?
Well, to kind of give a frame of how this, at least in my limited exposure, has played out. If you go back to the summer of 2016, you had a guy turn his car into a weapon in Nice. You had the Orlando nightclub shooting. You had black men and boys seemingly being shot almost every week We had a black cop in Dallas, Texas be shot in response. And you saw a lot of statements from CEOs and community leaders and everything about this has to change. And then you flash forward to this past year, 4 years later, and you could probably have a hard time naming on more than one hand the number of companies who in the 4 years in between had actually made meaningful changes on how people treated each other at work and stuck with it, right? So the good news, if that was like, there was not much change in those 4 years, I would say that, the conversations we're having with companies, it kind of breaks down into about the 15 or 20% on one side, the roughly, 30 or 40% on the other side, and the people in the middle. The 15 or 20 are people who are quietly going about the work of actually trying to make progress, which is not as loud because it means setting up processes, collecting data, building metrics, building buy-in, testing, measuring. Like when they do a business strategy, it takes a while. And so that's the 15 or 20%. You don't see much from them necessarily, but that's because they're doing it quietly internally. On the other end of the spectrum, there's 30 to 40% who kind of said, whew, I'm glad I didn't get caught in that mess. We're kind of back to business as usual, unfortunately. And then the folks in the middle, we just don't know where they're going to land. But if you assigned those same type of ratios, it was like 10 and 90 after 2016, right? Very few people made real meaningful progress. So that's good. The second thing, and Beth and I were talking about this a little bit off camera, is the difference between 2016 and 2020 is people experienced the pandemic and BLM while at work. And over that period of time, if you look at the Edelman Trust study, which they've been running now for 21 years, employers became the number one institution people wanted to trust in. And so there's this move of accountability that has gone inside the company as opposed to being external accountability of customers and media. It was employees this past year talking to CEOs and pressuring them, and they're not going anywhere. So that pressure from internal forces, which has not totally abated, is another reason why people have been sticking with it. But the companies that are doing best are those that are being ambitious by thinking small, meaning they're trying a lot of small tests and kind of startup ideas. And they're not doing things that are just completely outside their range of scope or what they do on a day-to-day basis. They're saying to themselves, what is our superpower? What do we do as a company? And how can we point our skills and our people and our resources at something in our lane that helps this discussion nationally? I'm a Packers fan, but unfortunately I have to quote Bill Belichick, which is do your job, right? Stay in your lane and do your job. And if you point your business at it, if you're an investor, fine, think about how you invest. If you're a real estate company, you can change how buildings are built. There's a whole bunch of different things, but the companies that are going to be doing this in a year or two are staying in their lane and not trying to be a different company. They're trying to be a slightly better version of themselves.
How do you ensure that, and maybe ensure isn't the right word, or how do you at least give your employees confidence that you're doing the right things? I think one of the things is that employees want psychological safety and they want to feel like their employer is doing the right things for them. What are you seeing that the progressive companies that are leading their way in this space are doing to make their employees feel good about what they're working on and how they're moving forward?
They're staying close to them. They're monitoring them and creating more open dialogues through pulse surveys and small group dialogues and upskilling their managers to be more comfortable having conversations so that there's a steady, more open communication, which was one of the keys last summer. Most CEOs we were talking to in the fall said two things drove them after George Floyd's murder in particular. One was they sat down with Black and brown employees, maybe for the first time, maybe not, but had a very honest conversation like they'd never had before. And they can't unlearn that. And the second thing, interesting enough, their kids. Their kids were coming at them across the breakfast table a year ago summer saying, Mom, Dad, you're so far behind. But those two things kind of stuck with them. So people are keeping those dialogues open. They're using their employees and their employee resource groups as sounding boards and co-creators of approaches. By doing so, they're turning their employees into net promoters, which I think is going to help them later because they have more information. And then the really tricky thing that everybody needs to do is, in the corporate sector, private sector, people are used to either announcing something before it happens. Hey, we're going to announce this big program and we're going to tell you all about it now and have fireworks, or wait all the way until the end and they have a bunch of data a couple years later and say, guess what's been going on, but you couldn't feel it for the past couple of years. The solution is to do neither of those, but to show your work as you go Be honest about what you're trying and what's working and not working, and candidly be open about the fact that you're not going to get it all right. Like the idea that you're going to suddenly be a conflict-free environment where no one's going to have a dispute at work, where no one's going to say something that's really going to upset somebody else periodically. Those are the standards people can't live to. Like humans can't live to them, and organizations are a bundle of humans. So being honest about, hey, we're going to try a bunch of stuff. Some's going to work, some's not going to work. We're going to be talking to you a lot. You'll give us feedback. We'll take most of it. We're not going to take all of it, and we're going to be focused. And so our version of ambition is to be doing a couple things better. Once we get good at those, we'll do a couple more.
I think that's really good because companies do get concerned, especially those that this is a new space for, that they get worried that perhaps they're going to say something wrong or they're going to do something wrong. So
yeah,
I think what you just mentioned is a really good place for companies to occupy, to say, yeah, we're going to try some things. We may get some things wrong. On top of what you just said, what other advice?
Can I jump in there? Just got to jump in there.
Yeah.
This is a really important point.
Yeah.
People are fearful of language.
Yes.
They are fearful of cancel culture. They're fearful of saying the wrong thing. A couple of things I would just say that I think are observably true, which is first, the cost of not saying something has gone way up. You are complicit. That is a vote for the status quo. And in times of change, the status quo is what people are against. So I would argue the risk of not saying something has become higher than the risk of saying something and making a mistake. The second thing is, when you take a position and there's some risk to you, you are more believable. In all your efforts to try to get people to believe that you're serious, it's in moments like these that you do take some risk and may stumble a little bit, but stick to your netting. That's actually when you build a long-term brand. It just is a little noisy in between, and you've got to be willing to take the noise of people every once in a while not liking you. Not every customer buys your product. Not every customer uses your service. Not everybody thinks you're great. You just have to get a little used to it being a little louder at times and maybe more personal.
Jonathan, something that you said as well, I think it's important for companies to value the opinions of their employees, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. It's such a hard position to be in, to go up to your supervisors or go up in these types of meetings and really show yourself, be that raw person that says, this is something that mm-hmm. our company has maybe failed on the employee side through the years. Here's my opinion on it. I think that as long as the employees are feeling that they've got that safe space and they're not going to be put in a poor position because of their opinions or their experiences, I think that's something very, very important for the companies to get across. And those that are doing that well are really going to be successful in this, I think.
I think that's right. And I think there's two big risks that people should be worried about if what you just said makes them ask themselves, hey, have we been doing the right thing? One, we're going to go to a hybrid model of in the office, not in the office. And we're going to take the flatness of everybody being on Zoom, like the egalitarian nature of it, and it's going to shift again, which means voices in the room are going to get louder again versus voices that are not. And you might not be in the room, not because you're in another geography and it's been this case all along. You might not have daycare for your kids that day, or you might be homeschooling. So the point is, the risk that some people's voices start to become quieter again is going up. As people start to socialize and work again, and some people get to socialize with the boss and some don't, again, people's voices might start to get a little quieter. And so being very intentional, to your point, about maintaining this space to have these conversations. And the bad news for managers and leaders is you got to go first. You got to be vulnerable first. You got to talk about these things first. You have to talk about them often. You have to get to the point where people are finishing your sentences so you know they've heard you on these things about how you're feeling when you're uncertain, when you don't feel so great, when you're distracted by things going on with your kids. You need to just keep saying that to create the conditions.
When I was at Cisco, we used to talk a lot about there are certain things that you had to be willing to put your badge on the table over to say, look, this has to happen or I'm quitting or I'm not going to be here anymore. How do you encourage people with this discussion to say there are, put my badge on the table moments, and how do you encourage people to do that and say this is the right thing to do? Because there are people that they're not necessarily good at that. They're in a corporation that's, very very old school, is not progressive. How do you coach people up to do that, or tell them to do the right thing?
When I was in high school, Donna Shalala, who was the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin, gave our commencement speech. It's the only commencement speech I remember the theme of in my own, or any kind of speech. She told us, dare to be
Your old boss wouldn't like that.
Yeah, no, I remember all his speeches. I got him abroad. Yeah, exactly. But she talked about daring to be dissatisfied.
Mm-hmm.
And her point was, like, life's short. So if you're at something or you're part of a group and it just doesn't fit you, then move on. Like, dare to be dissatisfied. Either fix it, which was part of her message, or move on. What I can tell people, if you're the employee or listening to this conversation, is if you're in an organization and a setup that's not working for you, the probability you will perform the people next to you who like it is low. It just is, right? So go find a place where you're in your natural flow. But the other thing I would just say, because I used to get asked a lot about conformity by younger people, especially at BlackRock, is they're onboarding. I'm here for all my my special capabilities. I don't want to conform. How should I think about that? And this is the best answer I could give them. I'm not sure this is a great one, but this is the only one I could give. So you all haven't met me in person. I'm 6'2". I'm loud. I'm like, when I land in,
I'm loud, so
there you go. Yeah, exactly. There you go. So Beth, you may resonate with this. When I land in Tokyo or Beijing, and if you were traveling with me, when I get off the plane, I get quieter. I literally get smaller. I shrink a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I'm in another culture and I'm aware of the fact that I don't want to be this disrespectful, loud American. And so I listen a lot more, which is really good for me. I slow down and speak more slowly. And I do all these things in order to be respectful and to be heard. Mm-hmm. And I don't call it conformity, I call it travel. Right? But there's something that might happen in the street in front of me between two people where my reaction would appear more American, like I might get involved or protect somebody or do something that might be different than how it might be handled in a different culture, because it crosses a line of mine, right? Where I then, like need to do something that is more boisterous or loud or whatever, or just different than people might have handled it otherwise. Right. And so I would just say the other way to think about this is, if you would do it when you landed in another culture, when you go to work, you are landing in another culture. There's a way of operating, there's a language, there are habits. So there's a certain amount of fitting in that needs to go on. But when you cross one of those lines and you know it, dare to be dissatisfied, fix it or move on.
Yeah.
Jonathan, for those companies that haven't started to do anything, what is your recommendation to them? What would you tell them to do if they're still sitting on the sidelines, sort of going, oh gosh, I don't know what to do? What would you counsel them to do?
The good news is, who remembers who did something a month ago? So the good news is, one of my favorite proverbs is, a Chinese proverb that says it's the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. Start. Get going, get moving, and do something. The good news is you don't have to do a lot. If you've been doing very little, a small change will be very recognizable. So you'll get a lot of credit for the initial changes. And again, think about a couple of things that you want to do in common. I would focus on this next 6 to 8 months and both the moving into a hybrid world and how do we protect some of the things that came out of this past year that were better and do it as a team, talking about it openly. And I would focus on burnout and mental health. Those would be the two issues. They're related, but those would be the two things that are going to be affecting the most people, where you can invite people into the conversation. You can do small activations about people checking in with each other, as well as fancy and bigger interventions from a benefits perspective or a strategy perspective. But those issues have been mounting. They're going to be real. And you can start there and build up the muscle memory for behavior change in your organization.
I was talking to a CHRO yesterday, and they brought up something of interest to me. And they mentioned that one of the things that they're starting to think about is in the hybrid model that we're moving towards, is that some people will be in the office. And then obviously some people are going to be, on the screen like you and I are right now. How do you design programs and interventions that will work based upon two very different scenarios. I'm virtual and I'm in person. Have you had any conversations about that in terms of, are they same? Are they different? Do we try to capture people, in two unique ways? I'd be curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so a bunch of reactions. And by the way, what's interesting about the way we kind of think about work is we let people in our organizations interview people and decide who get to come work for us. And we let those same people run meetings and make decisions in groups. And we don't train them very often to do either very well, which is really remarkable. So investing in management capabilities around running better meetings and then specifically pointing it at some of these dynamics is a very, very smart thing to do, because you can get much better. So a couple of things. The first is, and I think the Biden White House is doing this, I'm not sure, but staying on Zoom for a while. Even if some people are in the office and some aren't, just saying everyone's going to do it from their office. We're going to be on Zoom until we figure out a way to do this the right way. Second is, if you have to have people in a room, let the people on the camera talk first. Go virtual first. Allow them to get their ideas on the table and get them into the mix before the group starts talking. Teacher managers be very disciplined about, once the camera comes off, the debate ends. Because if you walk down the hallway with somebody who you share a floor with and continue the debate, it disadvantages all the people who are not on camera. And again, bring other people into these conversations. Let your teams that you most often work with come up with ideas. Let them crowdsource amongst themselves ideas to make us better, and then put them in charge of making sure you and others follow through on them, because you're busy running meetings and you're really busy. But if you say to other people, I need you to be my accountability partner. If you see me do this kind of thing, or you get this sense from the group, you got to call me afterwards and give me the tough love. And I will really appreciate it. My face might turn red, but that's a sign of love for you. It might look like frustration, but it's love. But the point is, you just need to be the Black Lives Matter discussion and the Me Too discussion is about going from good intentions to being intentional. This transition, where everyone's going to be making this transition together, is an absolute time to be intentional. The great news is people will notice, and they'll get a lot of credit as a leader and manager for the stuff that you're doing. And a lot of times you don't. This will be a window where little changes, little engagement, little inclusion is going to go a long way.
Do you have a good example of an intention, somebody being intentional, that you can share what that looks like to people?
Well, I can tell you a company I was impressed with that I saw. So Brex, which is a small, high-growth tech company, when they decided to go virtual many months ago, I think it was like 7 or 8 months ago, when they issued a letter to their internal employees. And this, I think, is a trend that we're going to see broadly. But they decided to go virtual, but then they also talked about the fact that they're going to be getting people together. They're a smaller, high-growth company, so it's a little easier to do this on their headcount. But they're going to be getting people together regularly, I believe quarterly, but regularly. And so the money that they would normally be spending on real estate, they're instead going to spend on events. And I think you're going to see a lot more companies, and I've been certainly talking to some who are also thinking similarly, that they need to really upskill their live event playbook to make it highly interactive and focused on social and intellectual fabric more than work, because people will be scattered all over the place more and more. And so when you bring them together, you want to focus a lot more using actual neuroscience and practice and psychology and everything else to really design very sophisticated experiential events. That's something that a number of companies are starting to talk about, including companies who could potentially supply those services. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But the simple ones are people making very basic rules around staying on Zoom, stopping email after 5 p.m. on Fridays, clear expectations about response rates over the weekend, managers beginning meetings with 5 minutes of how are you all doing. Very simple, small, specific interventions that start to add up to people feeling like, wow, I may not feel a ton better in terms of my day-to-day life, but I'm working with people who care about how I feel.
The email one is such a huge thing. When I worked at a few companies, you could be working at 1 or 2 in the morning on your computer, and you would send an email out to somebody, about a topic that you're working on, and you would immediately get a response back from that person at 1 or 2 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
It was the most crazy thing that I ever dealt with at some of the companies that I worked with. And you would go to bed and you would be thinking, oh my God,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sleeping and somebody else is getting ahead of me because they're not sleeping, returning to emails, working on projects while I'm actually trying to get a little bit of rest. So yeah, I totally understand that. And you give people a little bit of mental stability back in terms of getting away from some of these crazy behaviors.
The best analog I've heard was from one of the people who helped Ariana start Thrive. He had been doing a lot of work with athletes in his prior life, and professional athletes are expert at recovery. So LeBron James famously spends millions of dollars on this, but they're excellent at. They go hard for 2 to 3 hours, and then immediately go into a protocol for 2 days to get their body ready for another 2 hours. And he said, as professional athletes in a different way, right? Like finance athletes or accounting athletes or whatever. Here's what we do. We go hard for like 12 hours, have a meal, cycle back up about 50% for a couple hours, put our device next to our phone or bed, sleep for a handful of hours, and then start over again. And he said, it's like you eating on your dinner plate, putting it in the dishwasher, running the cycle for 4 or 5 minutes, and then taking it back out and eating it again. It's like, it doesn't clean. You need to clean the plaque and the buildup and the stress out of your system. And professional athletes are great at it. Workplace professional athletes need to get much better, and you kind of need to force them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great point. I don't know if you saw this, but I would like to ask your thoughts around this. I don't know if you saw that Coinbase is moving to a complete virtual environment. They're getting rid of all their offices, and there's going to be no rewards for being in a corporate office because there won't be a corporate office. Everyone will have equal footing working virtually. And then you have Citigroup that said, basically, we want everybody back in the office, butts and seats. I want to see you make your widget. And if you're not making your widget in the seat, I don't feel real good about it. So talk to me about where you think directionally in all of the things that we're talking about, how that may impact Coinbase and how that may impact Citigroup differently, in terms of if you have any thoughts around that.
Well, I hope that the disruption of the past year that threw a whole bunch of assumptions and probably some inertia up into the air and destroyed it will allow people to do the right sets of things for their workforce, because different workforces are different. They're doing different type of work and has different demands. There are very few people I've talked to who are serious on this topic who haven't, over the past year, realized there are some things that you really just should do in person. And that those things, as much as, and who knows where technology will be in 5 and 10 years, but currently the virtual versions of brainstorming and things like that just aren't going to be as good as being in person, especially for certain industries. So there's a real value to that. There's the human connections as well. But whereas before we thought everything needed to be that, you needed to sit in a meeting face to face for someone to give you a download of a meeting they had earlier as opposed to brainstorm with you, I think they're going to right size all of that stuff. And so we probably will get a better answer. It's going to be bumpy, though. Some people are going to say everybody has to come back, and their employees are going to disagree with them. Watch, there's going to be a tension. Some people are going to go totally virtual, and then people are going to struggle to have connective tissue, might not be as bound to the organization, might not build as many friendships, which is an indicator of how long you'll stay. And then they're going to have to adjust. So it's going to be somewhere in the middle for people, but a sliding scale. The great thing will be if we can figure out a way to let the individuals have a fair amount of say in this. That would be a really, really good outcome. If employees have ability to shift where they're working and how they're working, ways that work for their family and for their lives. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that would be a really, really good outcome. I do think employees have more power now than they have had on this issue.
Okay, next question. Aaron Rodgers, is he throwing passes for the Packers on
come on.
game one?
Come on. I don't know. I hope so. I think that his best chance to win a Super Bowl is staying with the Green Bay Packers. It is painful to watch this whole thing go down. And Aaron, if you're listening, please stay, my friend. Please. That's all I can say. I don't know what's going to happen. If I had to bet, I think he comes back, but I don't know. I'm less confident than I was.
Yeah, I guess he kind of sees that Peyton model in Denver, and that kind of calls to him a little bit. You got Elway there.
Yeah, I think the part that we just can't figure out is, even though it's pretty clear that at this stage probably his best chance to do well is to stay at the Packers, there's an extra piece of this, which is this has become clearly personal, and that can trump everything. At the point at which you feel disrespected, this is a good lesson for people in the workplace. At the point at which somebody feels disrespected or not a part of the team or not valued, or even worse, feels that they're specifically not valued for a specific thing that's innate, you can't pay them enough at that point. And so anyway, we'll see. It's going to be tricky. It's another example of a tension between an employee and employers.
Exactly.
That's going on. Yeah, and he can't zoom it in. He can't. Football has to be. It's one of those things we learned. It has to be on the field. You have to actually be there.
Yep, coach to player. Absolutely. Yeah. Jonathan, any other thoughts for us as we're at a half hour? And I so appreciate what you've talked to us about. Any other thoughts for us on anything?
This is a reminder for the people who manage people who are listening to this conversation. If you're going to think about one simple thing, it's that, going back to the sports analogy, the best coaches change their coaching style, or if you're a soccer fan, management style, based on the player in front of them. Some they put their arms around, some they challenge personally, some they give responsibilities, some they ignore, some they talk to their parents. They change it for every single person. And the really, really great one, it's one of the first things most players will say about that manager, is that within 5 minutes, he was talking to me like my parent or whomever, like somebody in my life who I listened to. And so this idea that you go from a golden rule of treating people and managing the people the way you want to be managed to a platinum rule of trying to figure out how they are best managed, how they are best optimized. If you had one mindset shift, it's that. Because the next thing you do, if you say that to yourself, is, I don't know them that well. I actually don't know the answer to the question, so I got to ask them more. If you start asking your employees more questions about how they process, what's their optimal work balance between in office, out of office, does Zoom work for them in its current setting? Do they want to send you ideas the next day after you've had a meeting? If you just start asking, you do the power of inquiry, you'll get through this next couple months and year a lot easier.
That's great. We love that. Thank you so much. And then, Jonathan, how do people get a hold of you if they'd like to reach out to you and want to work with you? How do they do that?
Well, they can just call me and they can email me at McBrideJonathan2@gmail.com, just my personal email. It's fine. They can reach out. And if they have questions, they can obviously hit me up through LinkedIn quite easily. I'm pretty active. I do check it quite often, and I do get a lot of just simple questions. Hey, I'm thinking about this. How would you think about it? We're going into a situation and I want to talk about this. I get a lot of very simple, basic questions like that routinely, so feel free.
And as I started this conversation, that's an example of just Jonathan just being a really great, open, and wonderful person, as you can see throughout the time that we've had. So Jonathan is awesome, and I think so highly of him. And thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for being with us. We really feel like this was a treat and a treasure to have you for some time today. So thank you, Jonathan.
It was so great. Thanks for giving this the time that it deserved. We really appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
All right. Awesome. All right.
Thank you, Jonathan. We appreciate it so much. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you, viewers. We will see you next Wednesday. Bye, everybody.